and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 53. The King of the North. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we discussed the fall of Shahanshah and the ascension of Mesud I to the throne of the Sultanate of Rum. How Mesud, who will go down to be the longest reigning Roman Sultan, came to power with the aid of his father-in-law, the Danishmend Bey and son of Gümüştegin, Emir Ghazi. We ended with the death of Emperor Alexios Komnenos and the rise of his son and successor, the Emperor John, and John's campaigns against the Turks of Western Anatolia. And today, we will discuss the early years of Mesud's reign, but more importantly, the ascendancy of Emir Ghazi. And we will set Mesud on the road that will lead him to stepping out of the shadow of his father-in-law and becoming the supreme Turkish power in Anatolia himself. Now, up until this point in the story, we've really been focused on the Sultanate of Rum in this informal Season 5. This has been the primary perspective that we have been following, and for good reason. The story of the Sultanate of Rum is both deeply connected to the story of the House of Seljuk, which we covered in our prior informal Season 4, and it is the Sultanate of Rum that is destined to be the supreme Turkish power in Anatolia for over a century. But now, with Mesud on the throne as basically a vassal of the Danishmend Bey, the center of the story sort of needs to shift, at least for a couple of episodes. Because the primary driver of the Turkish story is, for the time being, not Mesud, but Emir Ghazi, the Danishmend Bey and the son of Gümüştegin. Ever since the death of Kılıç Arslan, Emir Ghazi has been consolidating his power over the beys of Anatolia, and by placing his son-in-law on the throne in Konya, his power was now basically cemented. But this is, in itself, quite telling. It speaks to the now ironclad legitimacy and power of the House of Seljuk. Even though he was the new overlord, Emir Ghazi couldn't really displace the Sultan in Konya. A Seljuk would still reign in Konya, even if Emir Ghazi was now the ultimate power in Turkish Anatolia. Indeed, I think that we should consider this as analogous to the powerful position of Atabey. If you'll recall from our prior episodes, an Atabey was in essence an emir or a bey appointed to train a Seljuk prince. In a practice that is going to continue in some form well into the Ottoman era, young Seljuk princes would in essence be set up as nominal rulers of a province and given an iktafif. And in order to teach them both the military arts and proper governance, an emir would be sent to oversee their education. The Atabey would therefore be the guardian, the protector, and the regent of their Seljuk charge, and would of course become incomparably powerful in the process. After all, they were the ones actually exercising power in the name of the Seljuk prince they oversaw. Currently, in fact, there was a powerful Atabey named Beylik Ghazi, ruling Malatya and the regions to its south as the nominal regent of Mesud's half-brother Tuhrul Arslan. If you'll recall from a prior episode, Beylik Ghazi had married Kılıç Arslan's extremely politically canny widow, Aisha Khatun, and the two of them now ruled from Malatya. And Beylik Ghazi, Aisha Khatun, and their charge Tuhrul Arslan still have a role to play in this story, as we will shortly come to see. Well, now, Emir Ghazi was in a position similar to that of an Atabey. He had placed his son-in-law Mesud on the throne as the Sultan of Rum. And though Mesud was not his charge, and the Danishmend Bey did not rule as a regent, the basic idea was in fact quite similar. Emir Ghazi was, in some way, drawing upon the legitimacy of the House of Seljuk to expand and legitimize his exercise of power. The Sultan was more than just a key vassal of Emir Ghazi. By marrying his daughter into the House of Seljuk, and in practice controlling the Sultan in Konya, the prestige and the legitimacy of the Danishmend beylik itself became enhanced. And it is from after this victory, in securing his son-in-law's rule in Konya, that we see the Danishmend beylik really begin to cement its primacy. Indeed, this would lead to the zenith of the power of the beylik. The Danishmend Bey in Sivas, Emir Ghazi, would now become the supreme overlord of the Turkish beys all the way from the Byzantine borderlands in the west to the Armenian highlands in the east. But this also tied Emir Ghazi to Mesud, because on some level it was through his relationship with Konya, his vassal sultan's son-in-law, that this was possible. But this had some potentially dangerous consequences. It meant that Emir Ghazi had to keep Mesud on the throne, and this was not free. There were other sons of Caliph Arslan who were not entirely thrilled about Mesud being placed on the throne in Konya. Remember the Turkish rules of succession. Any member of the ruling family has a claim, if he can fight for it. Those rules are still in place, as they will remain in place until the fall of the Ottoman Empire, almost exactly 1,000 years later. So Emir Ghazi now had to put down any challenges to Mesud's rule that might pop up. And they will pop up, of course. I mean, Emir Ghazi knew that there was no way that Aisha Khatun and Beylik Ghazi would ever bend the knee, and so their puppet, Tukrul Arslan, was always a threat. And in northern Anatolia, in Ankara and its environs, there was Mesud's full brother, Melik Arap, who had decamped to the region sometime during Shahanshah's reign, perhaps fleeing there while his brother Mesud fled to Sivas. And before we jump into the rule of Emir Ghazi, I'd like to pause and note that this period of vassalage would actually come to be, somewhat paradoxically, a great boon to the Sultanate, because Emir Ghazi was now keeping Mesud on the throne, so the chaos that had consumed the Sultanate was stopped. The state had been divided among the sons of the dead sword lion, and then eclipsed by the other beys of Anatolia. Even those beys that were, once upon a time, its vassals. Danishmend power provided a shield, and it enabled the institutions of the state to consolidate in Konya. Though vassals of the Danishmend Bey in Sivas, the state itself would stabilize and strengthen under Danishmend overlordship. And as we will shortly see, Emir Ghazi will shortly do his son-in-law a massive solid in eliminating any potential Seljuk rivals in Anatolia. This will mean that when Emir Ghazi finally goes on to meet his maker, it will leave his son-in-law Mesud in a fantastic position. The sole Seljuk Sultan in Anatolia, leading a new and rejuvenated Sultanate of Rum. But we will get there soon enough. Now, the first major rival that Emir Ghazi faced was, predictably, the puppet masters of Tukrul Arslan in Malatya, namely Aisha Khatun and Beylik Ghazi. And Beylik Ghazi had been on a tear. Indeed, he would soon become one of the most celebrated Turkish beys in Muslim history. So this is both a good opportunity to explain the background to Emir Ghazi's politicking in Anatolia, and a good opportunity to share the story of the famous Beylik Ghazi. Now, according to some sources, after marrying Aisha Khatun and taking over the charge of her son Tukhrul Arslan as Atabey, in 1120, Beylik Ghazi had led the forces of his beylik to victory against the Mengucikids of Erzurum, who were allied with the by now basically autonomous Byzantine duke in Trabzon, Constantine Gavras. Constantine was of course the son of our old friend Theodore Gavras, who had earlier battled the Danishmends. Beylik Ghazi defeated the combined Mengucikid Byzantine force somewhere in the east of Anatolia, further enhancing his prestige. And then, 2 years later, in 1122, Beylik Ghazi won 2 great victories, one through battlefield tactics and bravery, and one from kind of just sheer chance. First, in summer 1122, Beylik's uncle Ilghazi, the ruler of the Artukid Beylik, began a great campaign against the Crusaders. In particular, the county of Edessa and the kingdom of Jerusalem, and he called upon his nephew Beylik to ride to his aid. Beylik Ghazi thus rode down from Malatya into Syria to aid his uncle. But apparently, along the way, he kind of had a change of heart. Matthew of Edessa, who was actually a contemporary, living in Edessa and writing his history while all of this happened, tells us that as Ilghazi approached Aleppo, Emir Beylik, who was Ilghazi's sister's son, a brave and competent military man, stealthily turned around and returned to his district. Ibn al-Athir tells us that Beylik then besieged Edessa itself, but was forced to break it off. But I myself kind of doubt this, as a siege of the great city of Edessa is not recorded in Matthew's history, and had it happened, Matthew certainly would have written about it. And remember, he was himself actually in Edessa at this time, unlike Ibn al-Athir. We don't quite know what Beylik's goal was here, why exactly he retreated and turned back home, but it sort of doesn't matter, because as he was marching back to Anatolia, a crusader detachment led by Jocelyn II caught up to him. Jocelyn was the son of the Count of Edessa, Jocelyn I, and was himself destined to be the last crusader count of Edessa. With this crusader force approaching, Beylik and his men made camp in a marshy place along the river Euphrates, near a village Matthew of Edessa calls Taptil. Matthew tells us the Turks numbered 800, while Ibn al-Athir says 400. But regardless, the point is that Beylik and his men were outnumbered. Seeing the smaller Turkish force and feeling victory was a certainty, the Latins, of course, attacked, which, as often happens with the Crusaders, turned out to be a colossal mistake. Indeed, Matthew of Edessa calls them heedless and foolish for doing so, because Beylik had been able to use the marshes of the Euphrates well and had fortified his position. Ibn al-Athir tells us, "The Franks advanced, and by God's grace to the Muslims, the Franks arrived at ground which had soaked up water and become mud, into which their cavalry sank, unable to maneuver quickly or gallop because of the weight of their armor and horses. Beylik's men loosed their arrows at them, and not one escaped. Jocelyn was taken and sewn into a camel's skin." Beylik Ghazi had thus captured one of the greatest crusader lords, along with other famous knights of Edessa and Jerusalem, enhancing his reputation and that of his beylik immeasurably. Jocelyn II was packed off to the citadel of Harput, near Elazığ in Turkey, and thrown into its dungeon, as news of Beylik's triumph spread throughout the Muslim world. And then came Beylik Ghazi's big lucky break, because mere months later, his uncle Ilghazi passed away in Diyarbakır. The Artukid Beylik was divided up, with Ilghazi's son Timur Tash seizing Mardin, and his son Suleiman taking Diyarbakır. The two brothers naturally fell into conflict basically immediately, and both appealed to Beylik, which of course ultimately resulted in Beylik becoming the preeminent Artukid Bey and the leader of what was now basically a decentralized beylik led from Malatya, Mardin, and Diyarbakir. The rise of Beylik Ghazi caused great consternation in Sivas, as Emir Ghazi now saw that to his south a powerful Artukid Bey had arisen. And not just a powerful Artukid Bey, but a powerful Artukid Atabey, a man who was the regent for Tughril Arslan, a claimant to the throne in Konya, on which his own son-in-law and vassal Mesud now sat. Then Emir Ghazi's fear of Beylik Ghazi must have grown even greater, because in 1123, just 1 year after capturing Jocelyn and emerging as the preeminent Artukid Bey, Beylik Ghazi scored the greatest victory of his career. In a lightning campaign, he stormed down from Malatya into the Levant in April 1123. His forces soon came to the gates of Aleppo, the great prize of northern Syria. Aleppo was by now virtually an island in a sea of crusader states, and was held by the one Artukid Bey who had not bent the knee to Beylik Ghazi. Beylik ordered his troops to besiege a small fortress near Aleppo named Karkar, which lies southwest of the city on the river Orontes. But his siege of Karkar was soon interrupted by none other than Baldwin II, the King of Jerusalem. According to the Crusader sources, Baldwin was en route to try to rescue Jocelyn from Beylik's captivity. However, we cannot discount the possibility that the current Artukid Bey of Aleppo had pleaded with him for aid. Regardless, when he heard of the approach of the army of the King of Jerusalem, Beylik Ghazi broke off his siege of Karkar and swiftly moved to intercept the enemy. According to Ibn al-Kalanisi, Beylik advanced towards him, and the two armies met in the vicinity of Manzara. Baldwin was defeated and captured, and became a prisoner in Beylik's hands, along with a number of his principal knights. Beylik had captured yet another Crusader lord, and not just any Crusader lord, but the very King of Jerusalem himself. His estimation in the eyes of the Muslim world grew immeasurably, as did the fear of him among the Christians. He was now the great hero of the jihad against the Crusaders. Indeed, the city of Tyre, now the only Muslim-held city on the Mediterranean in all of Syria, dashed off an invitation and a plea to Beylik Ghazi to lead them in their desperate struggle with the Crusaders. From here, with the King of Jerusalem packed off to prison, Beylik advanced back north to Aleppo and put the city to siege. He ordered the crops around the city burned, and Aleppo soon capitulated. Beylik Ghazi followed this up by moving south and capturing the castle of Al-Bara from the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, and he also captured the bishop who ruled it, adding to his rather impressive and growing collection of hostage Crusader lords. And now he was also the Emir of Aleppo. Truly a stunning, stunning rise, even if his Crusader hostages would shortly stage a jailbreak. And this was a rise that made a certain bey in Sivas more than a little bit apprehensive. But the fall would come for Beylik just as quickly as the rise. In 1124, just a year after his momentous capture of both the King of Jerusalem and the great city of Aleppo, Beylik Ghazi took the field again, this time leaving Aleppo to march northeast to Menbij, a critical town and citadel near the river Euphrates. We last saw Menbij as the scene of a great battle between Emperor Romanos Diogenes and the Nawakia before Manzikert. It was at this time held by a bey named Hassan, a son of Gumushtigin, and thus a half-brother and vassal of Emir Ghazi in Sivas. Hassan had made an alliance with the nearby county of Edessa, and no doubt Beylik Ghazi hoped to finish off this son of Gümüştegin and then the county of Edessa, and thus consolidate his power over all of northern Syria. He was quickly able to take the city and arrest Hassan Bey, but as he turned to besiege the citadel itself, the Crusaders in Edessa sent out an expedition to relieve the siege, fearful of the growing power of Beylik Ghazi. But Beylik was able to beat off this expeditionary army of Norman Crusaders, killing many and forcing them to retreat back to Edessa in despair. He returned to the siege of Menbich, no doubt elated and sure that he was to be the man to not just take Menbich but Edessa, and maybe even to drive these foreign infidels back to whence they had come. But fate is a cruel master. Matthew of Edessa tells us that while directing the siege of the citadel of Menbich and preparing for the final great assault, with great joy Beylik removed his iron armor. It was at that moment that a certain sun worshipper in the citadel let fly his arrow, which pierced Beylik's side, delivering a fatal wound. Thus, an arrow shot by an unknown and potentially Tengriist pagan Turkish defender cut short the life of Beylik Ghazi. Such is war and fate. Sometimes one lucky arrow shot can change the course of history. According to Muslim tradition, it was said, "This arrow was a strike against all of the Muslims." Meanwhile, Matthew of Edessa writes, Beylik's loss brought joy to the entire Frankish territory. However, within his own districts there was great mourning, sadness, and loss, for Beylik was merciful towards the Armenian people under his rule. So thus passed Beylik Ghazi, one of the greatest Muslim heroes of the Crusades. Upon his death, his army dissolved, or fell into confusion and dispersed, as Ibn al-Athir puts it. So turning back to Anatolia proper, Emir Ghazi now spied his chance. The stunning rise of Beylik Ghazi had rattled him, and Beylik had captured his own brother. I assure you, it was not just Crusaders in Edessa and Jerusalem who would have been ecstatic to hear the news of the unlucky death of Beylik Ghazi. With Beylik dead, the critical city of Malatya was now for the taking. Aisha Khatun and the son of Kılıç Arslan could be dealt with, and Emir Ghazi's leading position among the Turks of Anatolia could be confirmed. And remember, as we discussed earlier, after the establishment of the Crusader states of Outremer, Malatya now controlled one of the very few good passes to the plateau that led into Muslim lands. And thus, in November 1124, mere months after the death of Beylik Ghazi, a combined Danishmend Rum army marched on the critical city of Malatya. This army was led by Emir Ghazi and Mesud themselves, though of course Emir Ghazi was in overall command. Matthew of Edessa tells us, in this year, Ghazi, Emir of Sivas, son of Danishmend, went against Malatya. Through intense warfare, he besieged the city for 6 months, putting it in very dire straits. Then severe famine affected the city, and many died from hunger as the famine got worse. Eventually, the residents were forced to leave and go to the camp of Ghazi, since there was no food. Thus, because there was no way out of the great difficulties, they gave the city to Ghazi. The wife of Kılıç Arslan, who was the lord of the city, quit it and went to Mashar. Thus Aisha Khatun and her son Tukhrul Arslan were driven out of Malatya, and the great city submitted to the Danishmends. We don't know what happened to Aisha Khatun or Tukhrul Arslan, but they both disappear from the histories at this time. and I think we all know what that probably means. Emir Ghazi's position in Anatolia was now cemented, and the great city of Malatya was once again back in Danishmend hands. But while Malatya was now his, Emir Ghazi would still have to contend with the Artukid beylik in Mardin, Diyarbakir, and Aleppo. This meant that certain forces had to be pulled from Anatolia to prosecute the struggle. Troops had to be taken to Malatya, and now prepared to march further south. The numbers of Danishmend armies in Anatolia proper were therefore reduced. Now, Emir Ghazi probably thought that this wasn't a huge deal. His son-in-law had returned to Konya after the siege of Malatya with his armies after all. But unfortunately, there was still one prince of the House of Seljuk in Anatolia who was not totally subservient to the new overlord of Anatolia in Sivas. Melik Arap, Mesud's full brother. Melik Arap had taken up residence in Ankara, and he now held not only Ankara itself, but the nearby fortress of Çankırı, an absolutely critical citadel to control northern Anatolia. Both of these had, once upon a time, also been Danishmend possessions, and it is entirely possible that Melik Arap was originally a Danishmend vassal like his brother. But with Emir Ghazi off in the south, with Danishmend arms in Anatolia itself weakened, Melik Arap spied his chance. And so in 1126, Melik Arap assembled an army 30,000 strong and marched on Konya itself. He appears to have been determined to not only throw off the Danishmend yoke, but seize the throne of the Sultanate of Rum for himself. Though our sources are a little bit confused because the histories of Niketas Choniates and John Kinamos are a bit shaky on this part of Emperor John's reign, it appears from Bar Hebreus and the Chronicle of Michael the Syrian that Mesud was defeated in the field. This was really the nadir of Mesud's reign. Remember, he had been put on the throne and kept on the throne by Emir Ghazi. He had never really won a battle on his own, at least not yet. And now his brother, another prince of the House of Seljuk, had defeated him in the field, no doubt telling the beys of the West that now was the time for the Sultanate to end its humiliating subservience to the Danishmends. And Emir Ghazi was campaigning in the east. He could not easily ride to Konya to aid his son-in-law, or send him adequate forces to defeat Melik Arap. It was entirely possible that Mesud's reign, what would turn out to in fact be the longest reign of any Roman sultan, would have ended here. But Mesud was both canny and lucky. Realizing that he needed more aid, Mesud saddled up and rode west. Bar Hebreus relates, "Then Mesud fled to Constantinople, and he was received joyfully by Iwani, that is John, the king of the Greeks." Emperor John was at this point primarily preoccupied with wars in the Balkans. Indeed, the Roman histories don't even mention this visit, though as I said, they are very shaky on the early part of John's reign. But however preoccupied they were, Constantinople knew that division among the Turks was always a good thing, particularly if the empire was preoccupied in the west. If Melik Arap succeeded in taking Konya and breaking free of the Danishmends, the next step would no doubt be the resumption of Turkish raiding. Better to divide the Turks, keep them fighting, and keep an independent sultan from emerging in Konya. And so, the Byzantines provided Mesud with what troops and gold they could spare. Mesud took this army and began racing east. Soon he linked up with Danishmend reinforcements brought west by Emir Ghazi himself. Together, this army then marched on Konya, where Melik Arap appears to have still been besieging the city. Melik Arap was defeated before the walls of Konya, and fled into Armenian-controlled Cilicia. Relieved, Mesud returned to his throne in Konya. But the war with Melik Arap was not over. After regrouping in Armenian Cilicia for just a year, in 1127, Melik Arap assembled an army of Turks and Armenians and stormed north out of Cilicia. He made for Malatya and the southern mountains of Anatolia, where Emir Ghazi and his armies continued to campaign against the Artukids. In a rather audacious operation, Melik Arap was able to ambush and capture Emir Ghazi's own son Muhammad, the future ruler of the Danishmend beylik. From there, he raced back to his old home in Ankara. As Melik Arap fled, Emir Ghazi got word that Muhammad was a hostage and raced after him. Reportedly, Emir Ghazi was even able to defeat Melik Arap and seize his tents, but Melik Arap escaped and returned to Ankara with his extremely valuable hostage. Emir Ghazi, of course, could not tolerate this, and he was determined to rescue his son and bring Melik Arap to justice. And so he summoned Mesud, and together, the armies of the Danishmend Beylik and the Sultanate of Rum marched on Ankara, led by an absolutely livid Emir Ghazi. Bar Hebreus tells us, and he, Emir Ghazi, went and encamped against Kumana and Ankara, and he fought against them violently, and took them, and he brought out his son Muhammad, who had been shut up therein by Melik Arap, and Arap again collected an army, and met Ghazi in battle, and he was conquered. And as he was fleeing to the Greeks he perished, or was lost, and no news of him went forth. Melik Arap thus died attempting to flee to Constantinople. But this also meant that Emir Ghazi had now finished off 3 of Kılıç Arslan's 4 sons, Shahanshah, Tuhrul Arslan, and now Melik Arap. This left only one son of the Sword Lion ruling in Anatolia, Emir Ghazi's vassal and son-in-law, Mesud. And it would turn out that in the long run, this would be the greatest service Emir Ghazi would do for the Sultanate of Rum. Because with no other Seljuk prince around, Mesud was now completely and totally secure on the throne in Konya. And this means that when the end comes for Emir Ghazi, there will be precisely one man with a claim to the throne of the Sultanate of Rum. Though still a vassal of his father-in-law, the way was now cleared for Mesud to reclaim the preeminent role in Turkish Anatolia, as soon as his mighty father-in-law was out of the picture, of course. Because even though Mesud is now secure on the throne in Konya, in the immediate term, the immediate aftermath, the most important thing was that Emir Ghazi was now totally secure as the leading Turkish potentate in Anatolia. Michael the Syrian further tells us in an offhand reference that Emir Ghazi conquered 8 coastal fortresses from a Greek lord on the Black Sea around this point. This is confirmed by Bar Hebreus, who tells us that in 1129 or 1130, in this year, the satrap of the Greeks, whose name was Cassianus, went out to the Emir Ghazi, the son of Danishmend, and transferred to him many fortresses in the country of Pontus, and the rule over all of Cappadocia. Based on this and what we know from the Byzantine historians John Kinnamos and Niketas Koniatis, most likely these were fortresses to the east of Kastamonu, somewhere near the Black Sea coast, held by Constantine Gavras. And since the death of Alexios, Gavras has basically been ruling the Pontic coast from Trabzon as sort of his own kingdom, a kingdom that Emir Ghazi was now steadily encroaching on. And it was not just that Emir Ghazi was expanding his realm at the expense of Byzantine rebels, crusaders, and the Artukids. Within Anatolia itself, his authority had been entrenched. He had become the unquestioned overlord of Turkish Anatolia. Michael the Syrian gives us another intriguing reference of Emir Ghazi at the height of his powers, telling us, Emir Ghazi grew powerful and wiped out the Turks who were in the Cappadocian country. Then he alone ruled. Now it is clear that Emir Ghazi did not wipe out the Turks of Cappadocia. I mean, clearly, we know that there was still a sultan in Konya and other beys in central Anatolia, but this is nonetheless an indication of the extent of his power. And Emir Ghazi did not stop there, because as the overlord of Turkish Anatolia, he began to do the thing that both prior Turkish overlords did. Like both Suleiman and Kılıç Arslan before him, Emir Ghazi began plotting on how to expand his power to the east, into the heartlands of the Muslim world, from what was the frontier world of Anatolia. He had already been engaging in vicious power struggles with the Artukids, and these were going actually pretty well. According to Michael the Syrian, he even managed to kill an Artukid bey named Mesud, likely the lord of Mardin itself. The Crusader sources also tell us that he launched devastating raids of the county of Edessa, striking deep into northern Syria, and that Jocelyn I even died while riding out on the road to oppose him. The Danishmend beylik was now approaching the zenith of its power, the greatest military power in the western half of the Great Seljuk Empire. And Emir Ghazi was coming to the attention of the great powers of the empire, the Caliph in Baghdad and the Sultan Sanjar, far to the east in Khorasan. But for now, the real focus of Emir Ghazi's ambitions was not Mardin and the Artukid territories of the Syrian and Iraqi borderlands. Instead, it was on another region of critical importance to any Anatolian ruler, Cilicia. Cilicia is the pocket of flat arable land on the coast of the Mediterranean, where the coastline of Anatolia begins to turn south into the Levant. It is a rich and arable land that guards the best passes to and from the plateau, the famous Cilician Gates. The passes through which Alexander the Great had marched over 1,000 years ago. And Cilicia was now under the rule of not a Crusader state, but an Armenian dynasty with roots in the region that went back to the aftermath of Manzikert, nearly 60 years earlier. Armenian migration to the region had in fact begun nearly a century ago, as the Byzantine Empire incorporated the Armenian principalities of the east into the empire, and many Armenian noble and common families decamped to the lands of the empire itself, many of them coming here to Cilicia. And as we covered earlier, many Byzantine commanders in the east were ethnically Armenian, including prior lords of Cilicia and Antioch. And now one of these dynasties, the Rubenid dynasty, had taken over the region. This Armenian dynasty was by now basically its own principality, and it had complicated and shifting relationships with the Crusader states, the Byzantine Empire, the Sultanate of Rum, and the beyliks and emirates it bordered. And in 1129, a new Armenian prince in Cilicia had come to power, Levon I. And Levon quickly got into a fight with the nearby Norman Crusader principality of Antioch, now ruled by Bohemund's son, Bohemund II. See, Bohemund II was still smarting at the Norman loss of Cilicia, which we sort of discussed in an earlier episode. This had really allowed the Armenian lords of Cilicia to come into their own, to form their own sovereign principality. And Bohemund was determined to take back the ancient and critical city of Anazarbus, which guarded one end of the Cilician Gates. With this pass in hand, Bohemund hoped that he would be able to reassert the authority of Antioch over Armenian Cilicia. Bohemund II therefore gathered up his army and marched into Cilicia, prompting Levon to predictably freak out. And so he dispatched a messenger through the Cilician Gates and into Anatolia, pleading with none other than the overlord of the Turks of Anatolia, Emir Ghazi, for aid. And Emir Ghazi, seeing this as a great chance to expand his power further, responded. He gathered up his armies and raced down into Cilicia. There, near Anazarbus itself, the Anatolian Turks led by Emir Ghazi confronted the Crusaders in early 1130. And in this great battle, Bohemond II was killed. As his father before him, Bohemond was a great Crusader lord, the Prince of Antioch, one of the greatest of the Crusader principalities, a leader greatly feared by the Muslim lords, and now he lay dead, killed by Emir Ghazi. The man, incidentally, whose father had captured and imprisoned his own father for years before freeing him and becoming his ally. What a coincidence. And Emir Ghazi decided to advertise this victory in a truly gruesome fashion. After killing Bohemond, he had the dead crusader's head cut off and embalmed. He then sent the embalmed head off to Baghdad, a gift to the Caliph to demonstrate the zeal and the power of the Danishmend Bey. The news of the death of Bohemond spread throughout the Muslim world, greatly enhancing the prestige of Emir Ghazi. And the name Emir Ghazi began to be spoken on the lips of the Great Sultan Sanjar, far to the east in Khorasan, and on the lips of the Caliph al-Mustarshid in Baghdad. Perhaps this was the man who could restore order to the West. Following up his great victory over the infidel in Cilicia, Emir Ghazi turned his armies westwards and northwards, towards the greatest Christian kingdom of them all, the Roman Empire. See, the rise of Emir Ghazi had of course raised alarm bells in Constantinople. Earlier, Emir Ghazi had of course taken various fortresses in the mountains of Pontus from Constantine Gavras. This was a critical region to him, as it lay very near to the Danishmend homeland in northern Anatolia and the twin capitals of Sivas and Amasya. But it also threatened the maritime connection that tied the Byzantine territories of Pontus, now ruled by the rebel Constantine Gavras, back to Constantinople. And as always, emperors in Constantinople tended to fear the emergence of a powerful Turkish bey in Anatolia. Therefore, in 1132, a Byzantine army led by Emperor John appears to have marched east to enforce Roman imperial authority in northern Anatolia. Like I said, our sources for this period are not great, as both John Kinamos and Niketas Choniates are very fuzzy on this early part of John's reign, and their chronology doesn't quite tie together entirely prior to like 1137. However, according to the Byzantine poet Theodore Promodros, in 1132, the emperor took his army east and captured or recaptured the great and ancient city of Kastamonu. Once upon a time, Kastamonu had been the origin of the Komnenoi dynasty that now ruled in Constantinople, and it controlled an absolutely critical patch of northern Anatolia between the Black Sea and Ankara. Now it lay in the fluid borderland between the empire and the Turks of Anatolia. After taking Kastamonu, the imperial army then crossed the Kızılırmak River and forced a number of lesser beys in the region to submit. These included a bey named Tuhrol, a bey named Alparslan who ruled the critical fortress of Çankırı to the north and east of Ankara, and a bey named Yanal, who ruled in some unspecified part of the region. Based on a coin discovered by archaeologists that bears the name Yanal ibn Danishmend, we can say with a high degree of certainty that Yanal was yet another son of Gümüştegin, a brother or half-brother of Emir Ghazi that is. And all of these beys would have been his vassals. So the Roman advance was very threatening to Emir Ghazi. With Roman power in the region thus expanded, the imperial army turned around and began marching back, leaving a fairly substantial garrison in Kastamonu. And this was, of course, intolerable to Emir Ghazi. According to Ibn al-Athir, he had been off defeating the Crusaders in Syria in 1132 and 1133 as the emperor had advanced in the north. When the news of the Byzantine advance reached him, Emir Ghazi knew that he needed to act, both because the retaking of this region would protect the heartland of the Danishmend Beylik, and because he needed to entrench his power in Anatolia over the other beys. In particular, any beys who might have submitted to the emperor, or even who may have been thinking about it. But there was likely also another reason, one hinted at by Emir Ghazi sending the head of Bohemond to the Caliph. The desire to enhance his Ghazi status as part of buttressing his legitimacy and increasing his standing within the Seljuk Empire. Remember that after the arrival of the Crusaders, the Ghazi ideology, the ideology of jihad, became increasingly important to the beys as a way to legitimize themselves. It had become a part of holding their beyliks together, a way to get their lesser beys and vassals to bend the knee and to enforce their right to rule. And for a Ghazi lord who just killed one of the greatest Crusader lords, what better way to demonstrate this Ghazi status than to attack the greatest Christian kingdom of all? And thus, in what would turn out to be the last campaign of his life, Emir Ghazi gathered up his forces and marched northwest to Kastamonu. With him was his son-in-law, Mesud I, the vassal Sultan of Rum, and also his own son, Muhammad, who we last saw being rescued from Melik Arab. Soon, the great city of Kastamonu was besieged. No easy feat, given that Kastamonu hosted one of the greatest Byzantine castles in all of Anatolia. Indeed, you can still see it today if you visit the city. John Kinamos relates what occurred. Danishmend, who at that time ruled Cappadocia, encircled and besieged Kastamon with an army, since fortune prevented the emperor from waging war, for his spouse Irene had departed from mankind, while he had been stricken by illness and was recovering in Byzantion. He first wore it down by hunger, and then took it by siege. Kastamonu was now, once again, back in Turkish hands, and Emir Ghazi's position as the Lord of Anatolia was unquestioned. This was, in all likelihood, the highlight of his career, and certainly the zenith of his power. And it was now, while holding his new prize of Kastamonu, after having delivered to the Caliph the head of Bohemond II, that Emir Ghazi received the greatest honor. To explain this, however, I need to back up and provide a little background on what has been happening in the central lands of the Great Seljuk Empire. In short, though, things have not been going well. When we last really left off with events in the heart of the Great Seljuk Empire, Muhammad Tapar had been attempting to re-establish the power of the state in the western half of the empire, after the chaos of the civil wars and the catastrophe of the Crusader invasion. And he had, in large measure, succeeded in this, up to a point, of course. Al-Dawla al-Nizamiya was over, and the state in the west never really regained that level of centralization. But Muhammad Tapar nevertheless ruled as the unquestioned Great Sultan of the West, and reimposed some measure of central control, up until his death in 1118. Coincidentally, the same year as the death of Emperor Alexios Komnenos and the deposed Sultan of Rum, Shahan Shah. Muhammad Tapar was the last sultan to truly exert meaningful authority in the western half of the Great Seljuk Empire. Indeed, we can say in some sense that after the death of Muhammad Tapar, the only great Seljuk Sultan was Sanjar in the east, ruling over a Seljuk Golden Age, continuing on in Balkh and Khorasan. The decline of the empire in the west that Muhammad Tapar's reign had halted resumed basically immediately upon his death. He was succeeded by his son Mahmud II as Great Sultan of the West, but Mahmud never had the skill or the luck of his father. In 1119, that is the first year of his reign, Mahmud suffered a great defeat at Saveh in central Iran, an event that basically doomed his reign before it began in many ways. Mahmud was forced to give up key territories in the east to his uncle Sanjar, the mighty Great Sultan of the East, and then his brother Mesud revolted in the west a year later in 1120. Predictably, the authority of the Western Sultan over the Beys of the West therefore basically evaporated. Syria, Iraq, Oman, and even Iran effectively became the domains of rival beys and other powers. In Iraq and Iran, there were other Seljuk princes vying for power. In northern Iraq, there were the Artukids and the Zengid beylik, led by the great Imad al-Din Zengi, the man who will pave the way for Saladin in many ways. In Kirman and Oman, the descendants of Kavort ruled their own sultanate, in many ways a southeastern Iranian counterpart to the sultans of Rum in Anatolia. In Baghdad and its environs, the Abbasid caliphs were able to claw back temporal power for themselves. In Anatolia, there were of course Emir Ghazi, Sultan Mesud, and the other Anatolian beys. And across Syria, there were a host of Arab and Turkish beys, at least those in the areas not under Crusader rule. In short, the central authority of the Great Sultan in the West totally collapsed. A situation made even worse with the death of Mahmud II in Esfahan in 1131. He was followed by even weaker rulers, his son Daoud and his brother Tuhrul III, but these men had no actual authority. They were merely playthings for the mighty emirs of the West and the caliphs in Baghdad, as the Great Seljuk Empire in the West effectively stopped existing outside of Iran, while even in Iran itself, the power of the sultans was a shadow of what it once was. And so, with there being no real ruler in the West, both the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustarshid and Sanjar, the Great Sultan of the East, were looking for a powerful bey who could bring order to the western half of the empire, especially the lands outside of Iran. And that brought Emir Ghazi and his fantastic victories against both the Crusaders and Byzantium to their attention. Perhaps this was the man to bring order to the chaotic lands of the disintegrating Western Empire. And thus, in late 1134, messengers departed to the frontier world of Anatolia, to Emir Ghazi, sent by none other than the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad and the Great Seljuk Sultan in Khorasan far to the east. The messengers carried with them 4 black banners, that is, the black banners that served as the flag of the Abbasid Caliphate, going all the way back to the earliest days of the Abbasid Revolution, golden chains and trumpets and drums. And they also bore a firman, that is a royal decree, from none other than the great Seljuk Sultan Sanjar himself. This firman recognized Emir Ghazi to be more than a mere Turkish bey. He was now to be a melik, a king. In the words of Michael the Syrian, they sent him a crown and gifts and called him Melik Ghazi and styled him the king of the entire north. He and his descendants were now to be not just the de facto rulers of all of Anatolia, but the official and recognized kings of the north, potentially above even the sultans of Rum. Emir Ghazi and the house of Danishmend had now risen in the eyes and the commands of the Caliph and the great Sultan far to the east, to a level not seen by any prior Anatolian bey outside of the House of Seljuk. But Emir Ghazi did not get a chance to actually reign as King of the North. Because as the messengers were en route to bestow upon him this great honor, Emir Ghazi died of unknown causes in early 1135 in Kastamonu. He never even heard the momentous news of his new rank and the elevation of the House of Danishmend. When the messengers from the Great Sultan and the Caliph arrived, they found that the Sultan had recently passed away. Instead, the crestfallen messengers, probably a bit unsure about what to do, conferred the honor on Emir Ghazi's son, Muhammad. And as we will see next time, Mesud I would soon have some very choice words and thoughts to share with this new king of the north. Emir Ghazi's role in Turkish history is very poorly remembered today. Because the Sultanate of Rum is going to reclaim its position as the leading Turkish state in Anatolia at the expense of the Danishmends sort of get overshadowed. This is especially true because the later court historians and scholars patronized by the Sultanate would of course prefer to gloss over this period of vassalage of the sultans, to present the rule of the line of Kutalmış as inevitable and unchallenged since the very beginning of the dynasty. But Emir Ghazi represents a great what-if. Perhaps, as King of the North, he would have been able to completely supplant his vassal in Konya. Perhaps it would have been the House of Danishmend, and not the line of Kutalmış, that would rule in Anatolia until the coming of the Mongols. It certainly was a possibility. At the time of Emir Ghazi's death, his beylik, his kingdom, was the unquestioned overlord of Anatolia. It is entirely possible, perhaps at the time even likely, that this young kingdom would have grown and conquered. But as we will see next time, it just wasn't to be. And in fact, Emir Ghazi's real legacy will be, sort of perversely, that his reign actually marked the beginning of the resurgence of the Sultanate of Rum under his son-in-law, Mesud. In the act of conquering Anatolia, Emir Ghazi had placed his son-in-law on the throne in Konya, and then had been basically forced to eliminate any other princes of the House of Seljuk that opposed him. This cleared the board of challengers to Mesud, and the stability provided by Danishmend overlordship actually arrested the decline of the Sultanate that had begun after Kılıç Arslan's death. Subservient to, but protected by Emir Ghazi in Sivas, the court in Konya had been able to catch its footing and had begun rebuilding. And so next time, we will see Mesud I step out of the shadow of his dead father-in-law. And we will see the Sultan of Rum vie for power with his brother-in-law, the new king of the north, Muhammad, over who will become the new master of Turkish Anatolia.